Kyiv in 3 days, and entire Ukraine in 7. Those were some of the most common predictions globally about Russia's second invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. Many analysts and researchers from prominent DC think tanks and research centers shared the same predictions and forecasts that Ukraine's downfall under Russian occupation is inevitable, and they turned out to be wrong. As someone who spent over 6 years in DC working alongside research analysts globally recognized for their expertise, I was not entirely surprised by their faulty conclusions about Ukraine. The research focusing on Eastern Europe and post-Soviet space is heavily Russia-dominated and Russia-influenced, and has only strengthened its grip since the end of the Cold War era. The continued existence of Russia as an empire has been significantly underestimated, primarily because of the approach taken towards Russian and Eastern European studies in American educational institutions and think tanks. However, in the wake of the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, it has brought about a newfound recognition of Russia's imperial ambitions, both historically and today. So my research question is, what impact do DC-based think tanks have on U.S. officials' foreign policy making regarding Russia, and how did that impact contribute to the full-scale invasion in 2022? The chapters of my paper explore Ukrainian political and national identity in the context of the Russian invasion in February 2022. They identify primary actors such as the DC-based think tanks, the U.S. government, the Russian government, and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. The secondary actors are the U.S. universities, Ukrainian analysts, the Committee of the Russian Soldiers and Mothers and Wives, and the Truth Commission. And the tertiary actors as Russian soldiers, domestic investigators, international investigators, and survivor groups. The chapters propose 3 interventions to address challenges and opportunities in the long-term foreign policy decision-making process and long-lasting sustainable peace in the region. The dynamic illustrated on the conflict map between the actors is complex and interconnected in certain aspects, explicitly focusing on key players that were introduced in the previous slide. Throughout the analysis, the study examines the network structures, social capital, structural gaps, shared interests, and intermediaries involved in these interventions. I chose a conflict tree to illustrate some of the root causes that contributed to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Russia-centric policymaking and research in prominent DC think tanks, on top of the translation gap, are only a few primary causes and at the same time drivers that led to the full-scale invasion. Due to the atrocious acts such as war, there has been a spike in interest in studies that are specifically on Ukraine focused, as well as other Eastern European countries, away from the solely Russia-dominated studies. Therefore, there is a need to enhance the comprehension of the Ukrainian political and national identity through engagement with American think tanks and U.S. institutions. This ultimately should lead to better foreign policy making that will help mitigate future wars and conflicts on the European continent. The first issue that has been identified is the need for more understanding. American analytical circles need more comprehensive knowledge of Ukrainian political dynamics and national identity. The goal is to elevate this awareness. The second issue concerns the lack of power and influence of mothers and wives of the conscripted Russian soldiers, as they suffer horrendous abuses by the Russian commanders and the general military system. The goal is to empower them by advocacy and protests against the Russian government, which in turn may create negative attitude about the war in Russia, and which ultimately might lead to Russia stopping the war. Last but not least, transitional justice in Ukraine will be the core after the end of the Russia's war. The goal is to uncover human rights violations committed by the Russian troops, protect victims' rights, and to promote positive social and institutional change in Ukraine. The first intervention strategy involves decolonizing Slavic and Eastern European studies from a dominant Russian perspective, moving away from the Russia's backyard perspective. Investment in research centers, fellowships, and classes, and specifically Ukraine-focused conferences, as well as collaboration between European and Washington-based think tanks. Opportunities demonstrate a more in-depth grasp of the variety of curriculum on Eastern European issues. In the long term, the strategy would improve the study of Eastern European politics among DC-based analytical institutes, resulting in enhanced foreign policy making among U.S. lawmakers. Threats and weaknesses present biases and political influence that might impede research process. The same goes for the Russian disinformation, which is still very common. The process is quite time-consuming and costly as well. The process can be monitored by tracking the growth of Ukrainian studies in the U.S. academia. It will also provide an assessment of the public's understanding of the Russia-Ukraine war as a reflection in the analytical center's research. The strategy for the second intervention involves collective action and support for the Committee of the Russian Soldiers, Mothers, and Wives through creative protest movements and social media spread. The opportunities that this intervention includes but are not limited to cooperation between the Ukrainian Ministry of Affairs in terms of prisoners of war exchange. It would raise greater awareness of the horrendous treatment of the Russian soldiers on the front line, potentially discouraging them from deployment. At the same time, it could cause distrust in the Russian government and the regime. Threats and weaknesses include prosecution and silencing by the Russian authorities. Russia is an authoritative state, and the Mothers and Wives movement also lacks significant influence, even though they exercise a special authority in the public. And by that I mean that Russian authorities cannot really hurt them significantly because their relatives are active servicemen. The movement is also a not anti-war movement, as many people outside Russia hoped. It is pretty selfish in the way that the relatives are not advocating for the end of the war. On the contrary, they repeat Putin's claims and support for the invasion of Ukraine. However, they demand better services and rotation of their service members and their relatives. Monitoring can be conducted by Russia's major and only independent survey institution, the Levada Center, to measure the impact of lobbying activities, public opinion of the war, and mobilization in Russia. Monitoring social media is also helpful, and empirical studies would also be practical in determining the success of lobbying initiatives. Transitional justice is going to be the core center in post-war Ukraine. With mechanisms such as Truth Commission, it presents an opportunity to monitor, document, and gather evidence on human rights violation by the Russian forces. It would help promote the victims' voices who have suffered with the initial Russian invasion in 2014 up to the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. It would utilize new methods of evidence collection that would be less harmful to the victims and would promote justice and reconciliation among Ukrainian people, especially among the people who have been under Russian occupation since 2014. The Truth Commission presents an opportunity to strengthen democratic institutionalization in Ukraine by establishing various mechanisms such as trust building, strengthening the justice system, and adopting legal reforms related to justice mechanisms. Threats and weaknesses of this initiative include unintentional harm done to the victims from repeated interviews during evidence collection, and silencing of the victims of the Russian war crimes in 2014. Also, the ongoing war hinders the process of obtaining justice, and the impact of Truth Commission may thus be limited. Not all crime offenders may be brought before the tribunal. Monitoring can be evaluated by the legal accountability assessment evaluation of the institutionalization of the transitional justice mechanisms and by gathering public opinion. I have decided to base my future 3 scenarios on the last intervention, the Truth Commission. In the first scenario, the Truth Commission has successfully investigated and recognized human rights breaches, raising international awareness, and establishing a hybrid tribunal for perpetrators. However, in the second scenario, the Commission may need assistance conducting thorough investigations due to limited capacity and cooperation. And the third scenario may have a mixed impact due to ongoing war dynamics and political realities in Ukraine, limiting the Commission's ability to promote reconciliation and responsibility. The criminal court for the Russian criminals may also not be established. In conclusion, reconciliation efforts require a multifaceted approach that addresses both symptoms and root causes of conflicts while fostering communication. International organizations are crucial for this. And transitional justice mechanisms like the Truth Commission are essential for acknowledging past injustices and promoting healing. Ukraine's Truth Commission is an opportunity to confront human rights violations and promote reconciliation. Long-term success requires ongoing engagement with war dynamics, ensuring the durability of peace initiatives and the diversification of analytical sources and their expertise in the broader Eastern European region to increase the better understanding of the dynamics there, as well as to mitigate future wars on the European continent through informed, accurate, and well-assessed research. Thank you.
Any Capstone instructors on Zoom have a question? Or Peter in the room? Peter?
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, I love seeing how this has developed. What I find so interesting about your approach is you're focusing so much on not the raw sort of political interests driving this conflict and driving the invasion of Ukraine, but on the kind of the framing and the storytelling that is influencing decisions about that conflict. And in particular, your strategy focused on US-based think tanks and institutions of higher education, I think is really interesting. What has been your experience as a student studying in the United States, sort of witnessing this from the inside, so to speak? Do you feel like the sort of decolonialization you're imagining is happening, or do we still have a long way to go?
We still do have a long way to go for sure. As I said before, this is my primary interest, why I have decided to focus on this since I have spent 6 years in DC, and I saw during my undergrad as well as in other research think tanks that the approach that they take is very heavily Russian influenced. So they would have a researcher or somebody who served in Russia, for instance, and they would be talking about Ukraine, or they would be talking about Latvia or Estonia, and they have no primary experience in those countries, but yet those Russian researchers, they're talking about countries that are not related to their field, and by that they're skewing the interpretation and the dynamic and the historical and national identity. So that is why I'm arguing that each individual case and each individual country should have their own people to represent, to talk about the dynamics, so we can have a more enhanced and more compatible and rightful approach when it comes to foreign policy decision making. And yes, as I mentioned before, there was a mistake that Ukraine is going to be occupied in less than 2 weeks, and it's 11 years now, still standing strong. So thank you.
Thank you.